Everyone who flies needs to know where the Boeing 777 is and why it ended up there. Big modern airliners can't just vanish without explanation.
239 people vanished without a trace. No mayday, no wreckage, just silence. For years, the world has been asking the same question. How does a massive jetliner simply disappear in the age of global tracking?
This morning, nearly 10 years to the day after Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 disappeared from radar and is believed to have plunged into the Indian Ocean, a glimmer of hope at this memorial for the victims.
The mystery of Flight MH370 isn't just unsolved, it defies logic. But now, with new technology, bold theories, and a fresh search underway, we might finally be closer to the truth than ever before.
What did it look like?
Like a wing. It was the wing off a bloody aircraft.
To really tear at the fabric of reality that a whole jetliner just disappeared.
What really happened that night? And why has it taken over a decade to find answers? Let's go back to where it all began. On March 8, 2014, at 12:41 a.m. local time, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 departed from Kuala Lumpur International Airport, headed for Beijing. It was a Boeing 777-200ER, a reliable long-haul aircraft used widely across the globe. On board were 239 people, 227 passengers, and 12 crew members. Most passengers were from China and Malaysia, though the flight also included citizens from a number of other countries. The plane's captain was Zahari Ahmad Shah, a 53-year-old veteran pilot with over 18,000 flight hours, and his first officer, Fariq Abdul Hamid, was 27 years old, relatively new in his role but fully certified. The flight itself was expected to take just under 6 hours. It was a clear, calm night, not unusual for a journey of this type. Initial reports from the control tower and onboard instruments showed nothing out of the ordinary. Shortly after takeoff, the aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The crew began preparing for a standard overnight flight. Passengers settled in, some working on laptops, others already asleep. In many ways, it was just another routine leg for a commercial airliner. At 1:07 a.m., a signal was automatically sent from the plane's ACARS system. That's the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System. This system is designed to send technical data about the aircraft to the airline and air traffic control. This would be the last transmission from the ACARS before it was manually disabled. At this point, no alarms were raised. The loss of an ACARS signal doesn't immediately trigger concern unless other systems fail or the plane deviates from its expected flight path. 12 minutes later, at 1:19 a.m., Malaysian Air Traffic Control received what would be the last voice communication from the cockpit. The message was believed to come from First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid and ended with the phrase, "All right, good night." This phrase might seem ominous now, but it was actually standard pilot language when switching air traffic control zones. The aircraft was about to cross into Vietnamese airspace, where control would be handed over to Ho Chi Minh City. However, just 2 minutes after this last verbal contact at 1:21 a.m., something much more serious happened. The aircraft's transponder was switched off. The transponder is critical for radar tracking, transmitting key data such as the plane's altitude, speed, and identification number. When the transponder was disabled, MH370 became just a silent, unidentified blip on radar screens. At this point, the plane essentially disappeared from conventional tracking systems. Shortly afterward, radar data from a Thai military installation recorded something strange. An unknown aircraft had made a sharp turn back toward the Malaysian peninsula. At that moment, nobody could confirm it was Flight 370. But the aircraft's movement was clearly deliberate. It changed direction without communication, crossing back over Malaysian territory and heading toward the Strait of Malacca. Back on the ground, air traffic controllers in Malaysia had still not raised any alarms. The lack of a transponder signal was odd, but not unprecedented. It was only when expected, ACARS data failed to arrive at 1:37 a.m., 30 minutes after the last transmission, that suspicions began to grow. Still, officials did not yet understand the full scope of what was happening. Many systems on commercial jets are automated and operate in the background, meaning a missed signal isn't always cause for immediate concern. Between 1:30 and 2:15 a.m., Various radar installations, both civilian and military, tracked the unidentified plane as it continued to fly west, crossing over Pulau Perak Island and then out over the Andaman Sea. At 2:22 a.m., Malaysian military radar lost contact. This would be the final confirmed location of the aircraft on radar. Despite all of these unusual developments, Malaysia Airlines did not formally declare the flight missing until nearly an hour later. At 2:40 a.m., the airline contacted air traffic control to report that MH370 had disappeared from radar and failed to arrive in Vietnamese airspace. This triggered a flurry of activity. The Malaysian military shared its raw radar data with US and British officials, and search and rescue operations were quickly set into motion. Over the next few hours, a series of international agencies worked together to figure out where MH370 had gone. Emergency plans were enacted, and search efforts were deployed to the last known location of the flight over the South China Sea. However, these early efforts were based on assumptions that would later prove incorrect. Meanwhile, at Beijing Capital International Airport, passengers' families were waiting for their loved ones to arrive. The scheduled landing time came and went. Initially, the flight was listed as delayed. But by 6:30 a.m., nearly 4 hours after the plane disappeared, there was still no update. At 7:24 a.m., Malaysia Airlines finally made a public announcement on social media, confirming that contact had been lost with MH370. This was the first time the outside world learned of the missing aircraft. As media outlets picked up the story, international concern escalated rapidly. Families were desperate for answers. Public pressure mounted. By now, it was clear that MH370 had not encountered a simple technical failure. Something far more complex was unfolding. Then came a clue that would change the course of the investigation. At 8:11 a.m., over 5 hours after the plane had last been seen on radar, a satellite in orbit recorded an attempt to connect with an aircraft below. This electronic handshake, though not initiated by the aircraft itself, was part of a system that routinely checks whether onboard satellite equipment is still active. The signal showed that the plane's satellite communication system had briefly come back online, even though the ACARS and transponder remained off. This seemingly small piece of data was vital. It suggested that MH370 was still in the air, even hours after it had vanished from radar. Using satellite positioning and burst timing data, analysts eventually narrowed down 2 possible flight paths, one north toward Central Asia and one south into the Indian Ocean. But it would take more time and more advanced analysis before a clearer picture emerged. In the immediate aftermath, the search remained focused on the South China Sea. That's where authorities had last seen the aircraft before it turned. But as more data came in, it became clear that the plane had flown much farther and for much longer than anyone had initially thought. On March 15th, 1 full week after the disappearance, the satellite data was finally analyzed in enough detail to suggest that the aircraft had almost certainly taken the southern route, deep into the southern Indian Ocean. It was an area of the world with little radar coverage and even less traffic. By March 24th, Malaysian officials publicly announced that MH370 had likely ended its flight in the southern Indian Ocean, far off the coast of Australia. It was a devastating conclusion for the families who had held out hope. No wreckage had been found, no bodies recovered. But with this announcement, the focus shifted from rescue to recovery, and to understanding how such a disappearance could have happened in the first place. The early search efforts were concentrated in the South China Sea. That made sense based on the aircraft's intended route and the last radar point before it turned west. Dozens of ships, aircraft, and satellites were deployed to scan the area. But after days of searching, it became increasingly clear that MH370 wasn't there. With no debris, no fuel slicks, and no evidence of impact, attention began to shift. The shift was driven largely by data received from a satellite operated by Inmarsat, a British company that provides global satellite communication services. The key information came in the form of what are known as handshakes. These are automated electronic signals exchanged between the aircraft's onboard satellite communication system and the Inmarsat satellite. Even though the aircraft's ACARS system had been disabled, the satellite data link remained intermittently active. Between 8:11 a.m. and 9:15 a.m. on March 8th, 7 handshakes were recorded. Each one marked a point in time when the plane connected to the satellite. While these signals didn't provide GPS-level location detail, they did offer something valuable. They showed how far the plane was from the satellite based on timing offsets. This information, combined with Doppler shift data, helped investigators draw several arcs on a map, each representing a possible location of the aircraft at the time of the handshake. 2 possible corridors emerged from this analysis: a northern route passing over parts of Central Asia, and a southern route heading deep into the southern Indian Ocean. However, the northern route was quickly ruled out. Military and civilian radars in those regions had not picked up any unidentified aircraft, which would have been virtually impossible given the density of surveillance in those areas. That left the southern corridor. This route pointed toward a vast, remote stretch of ocean southwest of Australia. It was an area with very little maritime traffic and limited radar coverage. While this zone offered no confirmed crash site, it became the most plausible location for MH370's final moments. On March 24th, just over 2 weeks after the disappearance, the Malaysian Prime Minister publicly announced that MH370's final location was believed to be somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean. The announcement was based on the Inmarsat data, supported by the UK's Air Accidents Investigation Branch. Families of those on board were informed that no survivors were expected. It was a grim turning point in the investigation, shifting it from a search and rescue operation to a recovery mission. In April 2014, further efforts were made to detect underwater signals. These were intended to pick up acoustic pings from the aircraft's black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, which are designed to emit a signal upon contact with water. An Australian naval vessel equipped with a towed pinger locator picked up a series of acoustic signals about 2,000 kilometers northwest of Perth. Hopes rose briefly that this could be the location of the wreckage. However, the signals were short-lived and inconsistent. After weeks of listening, the signals faded entirely. When robotic submarines were deployed to scan the ocean floor in that region, they found nothing. Later analysis raised doubts about whether the sounds had even come from the black boxes at all. Some experts speculated that a faulty cable on the equipment may have been responsible for the signal. Once again, hope gave way to disappointment. Months passed with little progress. But then, in July 2015, nearly 17 months after the plane vanished, something tangible was finally found. A piece of debris washed ashore on the French island of Réunion, east of Madagascar. It was identified as a flaperon, part of a Boeing 777 wing. After inspection by experts, it was confirmed to have come from MH370. This was a major breakthrough. It marked the first confirmed piece of physical evidence linked to the aircraft. Over the next year, more debris was found along coastlines in the western Indian Ocean, including parts of Mozambique, South Africa, and Mauritius. In total, 27 pieces were recovered, though only 3 were definitively identified as coming from flight MH370. Most others were deemed likely to be from the aircraft. Analysis of these pieces offered some clues. The damage pattern suggested that the aircraft had not made a controlled landing. Instead, it likely hit the ocean surface at high speed, breaking apart on impact. Some parts of the wreckage, including pieces from the cabin interior, pointed to significant structural failure. The discovery of debris helped narrow the search area further, particularly by looking at ocean current models to determine where the pieces may have originated. But even with this data, the Indian Ocean remained a daunting place to search. It's one of the deepest and most remote parts of the world, with depths exceeding 5,000 meters in many areas. Despite these challenges, an international search effort was maintained for nearly 3 years. Australia took the lead, supported by Malaysia and China. Sophisticated ships equipped with sonar and underwater mapping tools combed the ocean floor. By the end of the official search in January 2017, over 120,000 square kilometers of seabed had been scanned, roughly the size of Pennsylvania or nearly half the area of the United Kingdom. Still, no trace of the fuselage or black boxes was found. In January 2017, the search was suspended, with officials citing the lack of credible new evidence to guide further efforts. The decision was met with frustration and sadness from families, researchers, and aviation experts. While it was understood that the task was technically and financially demanding, many felt the job was unfinished. Later that year, an American company called Ocean Infinity offered to resume the search under a unique condition. They would only be paid if they found the wreckage. Their search, which took place in early 2018, covered an additional 112,000 square kilometers. Using a fleet of autonomous underwater vehicles, Ocean Infinity scanned the seabed more quickly than previous missions. Still, they found nothing. In July 2018, the Malaysian government released its final report on the disappearance. It didn't provide definitive answers, but stated that the loss of the plane was likely due to a deliberate act. It was noted that mechanical failure was highly unlikely, as multiple systems, including ACARS and the transponder, had been turned off manually. The flight's erratic path also suggested human input, rather than autopilot or automatic systems. However, the report stopped short of assigning blame. It concluded that without the plane's black boxes or additional physical evidence, the exact cause of MH370's disappearance could not be determined. The case remained open technically, but no new official search missions were planned. In the years that followed, interest in the case didn't fade. Independent researchers and analysts continued to study the satellite data, re-examining previous theories and testing new ones. Some focused on improved satellite analysis, while others used ocean drift modeling. The hope was that new technologies or overlooked data could bring fresh insight. One thing was clear: despite extensive efforts, the ocean had not yet given up its secrets. MH370 had left behind a trail of clues, but no definitive explanation. And for the families of those on board, the lack of answers was its own kind of grief, one that couldn't be resolved by speculation or partial evidence. Among the most widely considered explanations was the theory that someone on board, most likely one of the pilots, had deliberately taken control of the aircraft. This theory emerged not from speculation alone, but because of how certain systems were turned off, the erratic changes in flight direction, and the strategic avoidance of radar coverage. To disable the ACARS system, someone would need detailed technical knowledge and access to specific aircraft systems, likely from the cockpit. The same goes for disabling the transponder. These weren't one-button commands, and they weren't the result of a random technical failure. They were manual actions. Combined with the aircraft's path, a sharp turn westward followed by a long flight into one of the most remote areas on Earth, the suggestion that this was a deliberate act began to make more sense to many investigators. Attention inevitably turned toward the flight crew. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, the pilot in command, had been flying for Malaysia Airlines since 1981. He was experienced, had over 18,000 flight hours, and was known among colleagues as professional and competent. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, on the other hand, was relatively new to the 777, but had been flying with the airline for several years and was considered capable. The official investigation found no evidence of mechanical failure, sabotage from outside the plane, or signs of distress from either pilot prior to departure. However, the psychological profiles of the pilots were scrutinized. Captain Zahari had no known history of mental illness, and according to the official report, there were no red flags, no signs of financial stress, behavioral changes, or family problems. Yet questions persisted. Zahari was known to have a home flight simulator. During the investigation, Malaysian authorities retrieved data from the simulator and found that it included a simulated flight path into the southern Indian Ocean, similar in direction to where MH370 was believed to have ended up. Some saw this as possible evidence of premeditation, although others argued it could simply reflect the curiosity of an experienced pilot exploring various routes. The final report noted that while this simulator data could not prove intent, it also could not be dismissed entirely. There were no known reasons why Zahari would carry out such an act, but investigators acknowledged that mental health can be difficult to assess, even in retrospect. Supporters of the pilot suicide theory point to other incidents in aviation history. In 2015, Germanwings Flight 9525 crashed into the French Alps after the co-pilot, Andreas Lubitz, deliberately locked the captain out of the cockpit and flew the plane into the mountains. Lubitz had a documented history of mental illness and had been declared unfit to fly by a doctor, though his employer hadn't been informed. But in the case of MH370, no such warnings existed. Both pilots passed health checks and were cleared for duty. Nevertheless, investigators couldn't rule out the possibility that one of them had managed to take sole control of the aircraft and disable the other. The scenario often suggested involves the captain locking the first officer out of the cockpit and depressurizing the cabin at cruising altitude. At 35,000 feet, this would lead to hypoxia, a lack of oxygen, for everyone on board, possibly rendering passengers and cabin crew unconscious within minutes. The cockpit has independent oxygen supply systems, which would allow the person inside to remain conscious. This would enable the pilot to continue flying the aircraft for hours, uninterrupted and undetected deep into the Indian Ocean. The theory fits many elements of the timeline and satellite data. It also aligns with the observation that the aircraft avoided known radar zones and air defense identification areas during its turn back across Malaysia and toward the open sea. Other theories have suggested a hijacking by someone else on board, though this is considered less likely. Of the 227 passengers, 2 Iranian men were traveling on stolen passports, which initially raised concerns. But investigations found they were simply asylum seekers attempting to enter Europe and had no ties to any terrorist groups. The idea of a passenger or group of passengers overpowering the crew and taking control of the aircraft has also been explored. However, the technical knowledge required to shut down communications and operate the aircraft is significant. Modern cockpit doors are reinforced and locked from the inside, making unauthorized entry nearly impossible once the door is secured. Moreover, there was no distress signal or evidence of a struggle. A more elaborate theory suggests the possibility of a stowaway, someone hiding in the avionics bay or underfloor area near the cockpit before takeoff. This area, while restricted, has been speculated about by some experts. In theory, someone with technical training could access critical systems from there. But this scenario would require multiple points of security failure, and no credible evidence ever emerged to support it. Then there are theories involving government or military intervention. One version speculates that the aircraft was intercepted after entering restricted airspace and subsequently shot down by mistake. However, there is no radar, satellite, or wreckage data to support this, and no country has admitted to any such action. Another theory, widely discussed but largely discredited, is that the aircraft was landed at a remote location, possibly in Kazakhstan or another part of Central Asia. Supporters of this theory argue that the absence of debris for so long suggests a controlled landing rather than a crash. However, satellite data shows the plane maintained a southerly path, and no radar or physical evidence has been found to suggest it headed north. Some have tied MH370's disappearance to political distractions, such as the annexation of Crimea by Russia, suggesting it may have been a deliberate diversion by a foreign power. These theories, however, often rely on speculation rather than concrete data. Other proposals have involved the use of the Weak Signal Propagation Reporter WSPR system, a tool originally developed by amateur radio operators to track radio signals globally. In recent years, researchers such as Richard Godfrey have proposed using WSPR data to reconstruct the flight path of MH370. According to Godfrey, disruptions in signal paths recorded by the WSPR network may correspond with the aircraft's movement across remote regions. By overlaying these signal anomalies with known satellite data, his model suggests that the aircraft may have performed maneuvers, including a figure-8 pattern, near its final descent. Critics of the WSPR theory argue that the technology was not designed for aircraft tracking and that signal disruptions could be caused by many unrelated factors. However, proponents believe that even if the method isn't perfect, it may offer additional data points in the absence of other evidence. Meanwhile, the independent study by veteran 777 pilots Captain Patrick Blelly and Jean-Luc Marchand has focused on refining possible crash zones using flight performance modeling and system logic. Their work complements other investigations and supports the idea that MH370 followed a relatively straight path into the Indian Ocean, likely on autopilot, until fuel exhaustion occurred. Despite differences in methodology, many of these studies converge on a similar conclusion: that the aircraft traveled for several hours after radar contact was lost, eventually running out of fuel and crashing into the southern Indian Ocean. The precise crash site, however, remains unknown. Years after the disappearance, these investigations continue, driven largely by independent researchers, aviation experts, and families of the victims who refuse to give up. With no official search currently underway, it is these efforts, often unpaid and under-recognized, that are keeping the mystery of MH370 alive in public awareness. Ocean Infinity, a marine robotics company based in the United States, first entered the MH370 investigation in 2018. Back then, the company proposed an innovative offer to the Malaysian government. They would carry out an extensive deep-sea search at their own expense and only receive payment if they actually located the missing aircraft. This no-find, no-fee model made headlines at the time and set them apart from previous search efforts that were publicly funded regardless of outcome. Between January and June 2018, Ocean Infinity conducted their first search for MH370. Using a fleet of autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, the company scanned over 112,000 square kilometers of ocean floor. These AUVs could dive to extreme depths, operate without human pilots, and collect detailed sonar imagery of the seabed. The area they covered in just a few months was more than 4 times what had been searched over the previous 3 years by government agencies. Yet, despite the impressive technology and the scope of the mission, no trace of MH370 was found during that search. Still, the effort was seen as a step forward. It proved that large-scale searches could be done faster and more efficiently with new technology. Since then, Ocean Infinity has only improved its capabilities. The company has expanded its fleet, improved the resolution of its scanning systems, and refined its ability to process and interpret underwater data. In addition to aviation investigations, they've worked on deep-sea recovery missions for sunken vessels, lost cargo, and even warships. Their growing track record has earned them credibility in the world of marine exploration. In 2024, Ocean Infinity re-entered discussions with the Malaysian government to launch a second mission to find MH370. Once again, the proposal was built on the same no-find, no-fee principle. The Malaysian authorities, still holding responsibility for the investigation, gave preliminary approval for the operation. Although the final paperwork was still being processed in early 2025, Ocean Infinity began mobilizing its assets and started operations in the search area in February of that year. The renewed search focuses on 3 key regions in the southern Indian Ocean, all located near or along what's known as the 7th Arc. This arc is based on the final satellite handshake between MH370 and the Inmarsat satellite network and has long been believed to represent the aircraft's final location. The new areas being searched include zones just outside of the previously scanned regions, as well as a smaller area that aligns with recent independent studies, including those using WSPR data and flight path modeling. 2 larger rectangular zones have been targeted, one on either side of the previous high-probability zone searched in 2014 to 2017. These areas are thought to have been missed in earlier efforts, possibly due to gaps in sonar coverage or errors in search boundaries. Additionally, a third, more jagged-shaped zone further north corresponds with the flight path suggested by researcher Richard Godfrey, who has used radio signal disruption data to propose a potential trajectory for MH370. Ocean Infinity's vessel, Armada 78-06, is now actively engaged in scanning these regions. The ship carries several AUVs that can operate simultaneously, allowing the company to search large areas more quickly than traditional sonar-equipped ships. The data collected is then processed using advanced software that helps identify any unusual features or debris fields that could suggest a crash site. What makes this search different from previous ones is not just the expanded technology, but also the combination of new research that has emerged in the last few years. Independent investigations by pilots and engineers like those of Captain Patrick Blely and Jean-Luc Marchand have narrowed the likely crash zone using performance analysis of the Boeing 777, its fuel consumption, and the logic behind its final path. These findings align with Ocean Infinity's current areas of focus. There is also a renewed sense of motivation behind this effort. For many families of those on board, the mystery of MH370 remains a wound that never fully healed. The lack of closure has made it difficult for loved ones to move on, especially without knowing how or why the plane disappeared. With this new search, there's hope that definitive answers may finally be found. From a financial perspective, Ocean Infinity stands to gain $70 million if the wreckage is located. But even beyond the money, the reputational gain would be significant. Finding MH370 would mark one of the greatest deep-sea discoveries in modern history, placing the company at the forefront of maritime search and recovery technology. The risk, of course, is still high. The ocean is vast, and even with improved search zones and better technology, there is no guarantee the wreckage will be found. Some parts of the seabed are extremely rugged, with trenches, ridges, and geological features that can easily conceal debris. And despite improved sonar and imaging, the equipment still has limitations. Even small gaps in scanning coverage could mean missing something important. But for now, the optimism is real. The search is active again. Vessels are in the water. Technology is scanning the depths. The mission is no longer theoretical. It is happening. This new chapter in the search for MH370 also highlights a broader issue within global aviation. The disappearance of such a large commercial aircraft exposed significant gaps in international flight tracking and communication systems. In the years since, changes have been made, including new requirements for aircraft to report their positions more frequently when flying over remote areas. Satellite communication standards have also been upgraded. But many experts believe there is still more that can be done to ensure that no flight can ever go missing without a trace again. MH370's story is a reminder that even in an age of constant connectivity and real-time data, there are still vast stretches of Earth that remain largely unmonitored, particularly at sea. It also shows the limits of human technology when it comes to confronting nature. The ocean's depth, unpredictability, and sheer size make it one of the last great frontiers. If Ocean Infinity's current mission succeeds, it could bring long-awaited closure to hundreds of families. It could help answer the pressing questions. What caused the systems to shut down? Was it human action or a technical anomaly? How did the aircraft remain in flight for hours without detection? And perhaps most importantly, what happened in those final moments before the plane disappeared for good? If the aircraft is found, recovery of the black boxes may still be possible. Flight data and cockpit recordings could shed light on the flight's final hours. That information could confirm or disprove many of the theories that have developed over the past decade. Until that happens, the search continues, quietly, persistently, and away from the spotlight of news headlines. It is a search not just for wreckage, but for truth. For now, that truth remains hidden beneath the waves, somewhere in one of the most remote parts of the planet.